Alright, welcome back to the Narrowband channel. Now, my channel specifically deals with astrophotography. So, when this camera came out, this is the Olympus E1 Mark III. Naturally, I was pretty stoked about getting my hands on one of these and trying it out. Specifically for the starry sky autofocus feature that is in here. Now, I wasn't really expecting a lot else besides that. However, I did, in using this thing for almost 2 months now actually, uncover a lot of great things about this camera that make it stand out over the Olympus Em1 Mark II, and why I consider it really a worthy upgrade, and I do recommend it. So let's talk about the starry sky autofocus first. Now, the first thing you'll notice about most of these big telescopes is that the focusers that are on them are pretty extreme. And there's a reason for that, and that is because focus is really, really critical. Okay, sometimes focus, the position of the sensor to the actual plane of focus can be within several microns. I mean, it can be very, very critical as to, where your focus is. And Olympus has come out with this starry sky autofocus, and I gotta say that it is not beta software by any stance. It is definitely very well tested and tried out, because it just works very, very smoothly. It's pretty simple. I mean, you go to your autofocus selection and you select, rather than selecting manual focus or continuous focus or standard focus, you would select the starry sky autofocus feature, and you point at the stars and you hit AEL, and the camera will actually take a series of pictures at different points of focus. And then it will basically it will draw a curve in an algorithm that it has in the camera. And from that curve, it'll be able to deduce where the lens needs to be set in order to have absolutely good focus. And it works really great. I mean, it's actually pretty quick. I have always been using the slowest version of it. There's two different options. There's a high-speed one, which would probably be for if you were hand-holding it. And then there's a more precise one, which is a little bit slower. And all it does is take more pictures and spread out the points of focus where it takes more pictures, so that it gives you better focus. And it really does work great, but that's not the only thing about this camera that I like. Alright, let's talk about the most important thing in a camera, and that is the sensor. Alright, now I know one of the first things that DP Review complained about with this camera was the fact that it still had the same sensor in it. It was still using a 4-year-old sensor, which they called old. However, let's keep some perspective in here, okay? Astrophotography world, that's actually not very old, okay? A lot of the CCD cameras, the dedicated ones that people are still using, a lot of them are 10 years old, because, a new CCD camera hasn't come out in almost 10 years. I know the Kodak 8300, as a matter of fact, which is a 4/3 sensor, by the way, it's 16 megapixels, very similar to the Panasonic, has been around for, I think, 10 years, and it's still kind of one of the mainstays among CCD cameras. And it is a nice, high-quality sensor. And, yeah, it's 10 years old and people are still using it. So, 4 years old, that's not really that big of a deal. I know this is the first time, actually, though, that Olympus has come out with a new pro-level camera, okay, that did not have a new sensor in it. The E1, the E3, the E5, the E1 Mark I, the E1 Mark II, every single one of those cameras in those progression have had a brand new sensor. This is the first time they've not done that. That's not to say, though, that this thing doesn't have some advantages to it, especially over the last one, okay? So, let's talk about sensors in general and what makes these things different. So, first off, let's talk quantum efficiency. Okay, so this is the Olympus Em1 Mark I, and the quantum efficiency in this camera is 60%. Now, what that means is that 60% of the oncoming photons of light that hit the sensor will be detected by the sensor, all right, or at least have the chance of being detected. Now, the newer sensor, okay, is actually 76%, okay, which is a pretty good jump. There are actually some sensors out there that are even higher than this. I know the Panasonic GH5, I believe, has a 90% quantum efficiency sensor in it, and that's because it is using a fairly newer frontal illuminated type sensor. All right. Now, quantum efficiency, though, it's not the biggest deal that there is, and also it's kind of something that's starting to slow down. sensors for about 10 years there were really making good progress because the micro lenses that they were putting on those sensors were getting much better. They were getting bigger, they were covering more of the pixel, directing more of the light into the actual photodiode that's within the CMOS sensor or CCD sensor itself. And that is what has been kind of driving this revolution. Now, that being said, the new thing is going to be readout rate, and we'll talk about that in a second. But 60% in the older sensor, 76% in the newer sensor, and that's actually a very respectable amount. There aren't actually very many cameras that are a lot higher than that. Most of them are around the 80-85% range, so you maybe 10% better at most. Now, the next thing we should talk about is the readout noise, and this is the second metric by which we basically kind of determine whether or not a sensor is good or not for astrophotography or in general. Now, the readout noise is the amount of noise that the sensor produces if there is no image given to it. Okay, so if we have a lens cap on the camera and we use the fastest shutter speed that this camera can use, which most Sony sensors is 0.000032 seconds, which is pretty short. It's a lot faster than this is programmed to take, although this could take a faster shutter speed if the firmware was changed. But anyways, at that shutter speed and with no light coming into the sensor, it produces a certain amount of noise, or signal, should we say, that is read out. And I know the old Olympus Em1, the Mark 1, at its maximum gain setting, had a readout rating of 1.1. Okay. Now, the newer cameras, okay, it's about 1.1, 1.2-ish, somewhere in that area. And it depends a little bit on what gain setting you're at. Now, I can say, though, that the curve, okay, so as you decrease the gain in the camera, you're decreasing the ISO here. That noise rating actually goes up. However, your dynamic range also goes up, which is something we could talk about later. But this camera, the noise climbs faster at lower ISOs than it does with, say, the newer sensor. The newer sensor, I think it only gets to 2.4 electrons or readout noise ratings, whereas the Mark 1, I think it gets to like 3.6 or something like that. It climbs quite a bit faster. So this camera, if you use it at lower ISOs and you stack your images, you're going to get less noise versus if you were to use the older camera at lower noise or lower ISO ratings. Now, the next thing we should talk about is the well depth of the pixels, okay? And the well depth of a CMOS sensor actually varies based on the ISO of the camera. And this is kind of why well depth is so important, because it really is a factor into how sensitive the camera is. And also for those of us shooting in a light polluted environment like I do, the best sky I can get to around here within a half-hour drive is a Bortle 4.9, okay? And my backyard is like 6 to 7. So, the well depth of the old Em1 Mark 1 was about 20,000 photons of light. That means that the pixels in that sensor could detect 20,000 photons of light before they hit a saturation point. And then that saturation point, all right, would start to spill over. It starts to spill into the other pixels around it, and you basically get a completely white image that doesn't really have any information in it that is good for an image. The well depth in these new cameras, I don't know exactly what it is, but based on my calculations, it's significantly higher. It's more than twice as high. It's probably around 40, maybe 50,000 electrons, okay? And that's actually a huge bump, okay? And in astrophotography terms, that literally makes this camera, like, at least the older Em1 Mark II, it's 2 stops better than the Em1 Mark I, all right? Now, I know a lot of daytime photography reviewers said that it is a 1-stop improvement, but for astrophotography, because well depth is an important factor to sensitivity for us, it's really 2 stops for us, okay? And this one's actually a little bit more. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, also, as you increase the gain on a CMOS sensor, okay, as gain goes up, which is the amplification that we put to a signal coming off of a sensor, that well depth goes down. So having a deeper well depth and using higher gains, it's very important, okay, for us. And it really kind of helps us, and I don't know if I covered this yet, but light pollution wise, okay, so the sky has basically a uniform brightness to it, and when we, in our post-processing, do a background subtraction, which is where we pick a part of the sky that should be black, and we set that as our black point, and we subtract off of the image a complete sheet or layer, think of it as a carpet coming off the floor of information, and underneath that is the actual image, okay? Because of the deeper well depth of these newer cameras, that allows us to basically work in much more light polluted environments and still get a good image. So, big props to Olympus there for putting that into that sensor, or at least that technology. Now, and then there is the actual micro lenses themselves. So the older camera, a lot of the micro lenses would actually kind of reflect onto each other in the Olympus Em1 Mk3. The newer sensor has an anti-reflective coating that is on the micro lenses themselves, and so they actually produce a much better image for stars. Stars are going to be a lot tighter, a lot smaller. And I'll tell you what too, because of this, this makes focusing on stars, even with a telescope when I have to do it manually, it makes it a lot easier than it was with the older camera. Now, that micro lensing being less of an issue with these cameras, you know, I think that's pretty important to astrophotography, and it really is. In just every single way, this new sensor is much better than the older one was. Now, let's talk about the last thing here, and that's the size of the pixels. Okay, the size of the pixels. The pixel size of the old Em1 Mk3, okay, was 3.8 microns, okay, which is actually considered pretty large. The newer sensor, of course, it's a little bit smaller, but it's more like 3.4 microns, which is still actually pretty significant. That's actually kind of big as far as astrophotography goes. Really big is considered 5 or 6 or above, okay, and you don't really see that until you get into very specialized sensors. Usually they're quite expensive. All right, let's talk a little bit about the camera, its functionality, and its mechanics. Okay, so mechanically, and this is heat related, right? And heat is the #1 reason why I want this camera over the Em1 Mk2. So, here's the old Em1 Mk1, all right? If you read any photography blog, they're going to tell you that this camera versus the Em1 Mk2, there's about a 1-stop difference in high ISO performance. It's going to be the same for the Em1 Mk3 because they're the same sensor. Not so for astrophotography. Now, because of the deeper well depth of the pixels and a few other little things, one of them being thermal, the Em1 Mk3 compared to the Em1 Mk2, the Em1 Mk2 has a 2-stop advantage. Okay, that means if you were taking a 4-hour photo with this guy, you're going to be taking a 1-hour photo with this guy. Now this guy, and this is why I want this camera now, okay, and I give credit to the new processor that's in it. The new processor, it's very fast, and because it's fast, as it's taking images, it doesn't really have to work very hard, and so it doesn't get very hot, okay. This guy, compared to the original Em1 Mk3, has about a 2.5 to almost 3-stop advantage. Okay, that means that instead of, well, it would take me almost 8 hours of exposure time with this old Em1 Mk3 to get the same image that this one will take. Okay, all other aspects remaining the same. So that's the main reason I want this guy, because it's cooler. Now, how cool is it? All right, you've seen me in other videos. I have my little heat gun. I'm always measuring the camera. So, the Em1 Mk3, that thing, it gets toasty, okay? It's typically, sometimes it's almost 20 degrees warmer than the ambient temperatures. More than that sometimes 25, okay? I know I have been out here when it is in the teens, and the back of that camera is a toasty 45 degrees, okay? And it never gets lower than that. This guy, on the other hand, he does not get nearly that hot. He's maybe 20 degrees warmer than the ambient at the most, and a lot of times it's around 15 degrees warmer. This new guy though, okay, a lot of times he's only 8 degrees warmer than ambient temperatures, okay, which is awesome, okay, and that's a big difference in thermal noise. I'll give you an example here. So when you are above 60 degrees, okay, Fahrenheit, or 30 degrees Celsius, we'll use Celsius here. Every degree Celsius that you go up from there doubles thermal noise, okay? So with long exposures, that's a big deal because thermal noise shows up the most in longer exposures, which is what we're doing with these cameras. We're taking long exposures. So that's the main reason why I want this camera, okay? And yes, I'm going to buy it. I know the Em1 X actually has a heat tube in it, so it should even theoretically do better than this guy does. But I haven't tested him yet. However, I think the Em1 X may be too heavy for my telescope. Now, let's talk about the flip-out screen, okay? The flip-out rotating screen. Now, believe it or not, there are people out there who don't like these things. And nothing personal, but I think they're nuts, okay? The rotating screen, this is awesome, okay? When the telescope is in weird positions, usually pointing straight up, this makes composing your images and focusing the telescope so much easier, okay? I love the flip-out screen. And also, because it's way out here, I can keep it a lot farther from the camera, which also kind of helps with cooling, okay? With the old tilting type LCD screen, you know, that was as far away from the camera as I could get it. And this thing produces heat, okay? Which is not good for astrophotography. Now, let's talk a little bit about the buttons on this thing. I love the joystick, okay? The joystick is great. And I know they've moved the menu button to the upper left, okay? Now, when the screen is flipped out, this is a little bit of a pain. However, when it's back here like this, I really think that this is a much better spot for that menu button, okay? Because now I can control and operate the menus and do things with 2 thumbs, okay? Before, I had to go back and forth between the control switches here and the menu button. And that just, I think, is an improvement, okay? I'm glad that they have moved it up here. And I am glad for the new joystick, okay, because the new joystick is pretty sweet. Now, some of the other things that I would talk about in this camera, I mean, really overall, it's very similar feeling camera, but you know, the menus are much deeper. There's a lot more features in this camera. There's actually a ton of things in this camera that I have not been able to test yet. One of them being the neutral density filter. I can't wait to test that out in some waterfalls. But Olympus was extremely generous. They gave this camera to me for 2 months because the first month that I had it, we had all sorts of haze come through due to the clouds and, well, the smoke from California because they can't get their forestry under control. So they gave it to me for another month, and I've been able to capture some fantastic images with this camera, images that I thought were really not possible in the area that I live because of the light pollution that I have here. Now, I know that there is not a huge difference in the body design from the E1 Mark II to the E1 Mark III. As an astrophotographer, though, I can definitely appreciate that, because that means that when I'm stumbling and fumbling around in the dark, it is easier for me to find things and remember where things are because I'm already used to the Em1 Mark I. And I like that, you know, that's, I hope Olympus in their next iteration of the Em1 keeps the body very similar because it is really good design. There isn't really much that can be improved here, I think at least. Okay, enough talk, let's look at some pictures. Now this is taken last year with my Em1 Mark I. I'm using an f4 lens here, and this is 4 hours total, stacked over multiple nights. Really, I captured about 6 hours of data and I threw out a lot. But as you can see in the histogram, still there's not very much information here, even though it's a lot of exposure time. I think these were 30 and 60-second exposures all stacked together. Now, here is taken with the Em1 Mark III, and as you can see, huge improvement, okay? We're using twice the focal length here, but this lens is 1.5 stops slower. Despite that, and despite the fact that it's a wide open aperture lens here, we're not stopping this lens down at all. The stars are nice and tight. I didn't do any star minimization here. the older Em1 Mark I image that I showed you a second ago, that one I did do star minimization on. You can see here the histogram, those spikes that go all the way to the top of the histogram, those are the stars that are blown out. And in the older Em1 Mark I, there was many of those off to the sides. In this picture, we only see that kind of in the middle, and that's because of the very, very brightest of stars. And there's just also a lot more information in this histogram and a lot more detail for our eye to explore. Basically, just makes for a much better image. Now some galaxies. This is the Andromeda Galaxy taking the Em1 Mark I. This was a couple of different nights as well, but I managed to get 105 good 60-second exposures that could be taken and combined together. And yes, I did do star minimization in this image. Now here's with the Em1 Mark III, and a lot less exposure time. This is done in a single night, and I hardly threw out any frames using a lens that's 1.5 stops slower. As you can see, there's a lot more detail in the image, and also I was able to kind of preserve the colors in a lot of the stars, whereas when I really stretched it in the older file using the older Em1 Mark I really lost a lot of color. So I was kind of like a lot happier with this result, obviously, than my old result. So this is the Orion Nebula, and also the Running Man Nebula to the left there, taken with the original Em1 Mark I. This is several nights. I think there's about 4 hours total exposure time heaped into this image. And yes, this was the best result that I could get with my old Em1 Mark I on a telescope tracking. And this is the result from a single night. This is also a tracked picture. I didn't do any auto guide in here, no dithering, and just 35 minutes of exposure time. And as you can see, not only do I have much richer colors, but all that brown that you kind of see around the outside edges, it's not really noise, it's actually hydrogen gas that's not active. In other words, it's not being illuminated by any close by stars. So one other little thing to note here is that with this picture, I just did one set of exposures at ISO 1600. If you look back at the last picture, the Em1 Mark I, because the dynamic range of the camera isn't as good, and because the pixels the wells in them are not as deep, I should say, I had to use different ISOs in order to capture detail in the center and in the outside edges. So I had a class at the observatory, and while I was there I brought my own telescope and the Em1 Mark III and just kind of set it up and let it do its thing. And this is what I got after 19 3-minute exposures at the North American Nebula. And even as I was composing this and just looking through at the LCD screen, I was surprised that I could actually see some of these dark dust lanes showing up just in the preview. And this is a result that I really did not think was possible with the smaller, slower telescope that I have. But it is. And I think even with like more exposure time, maybe 5-minute exposures, and stack in maybe some shorter 60-second exposures, I could really punch a lot of the details and get a lot more contrast in this. So here is basically the rig that I use, and also the kind of the location that I go to. It's a fairly good Bortle 5 sky. It's close to a Bortle 4, but not quite. And sorry, I lost the audio here, so we're doing voiceover. Now you can see I control the entire assembly with my ZWO ASI Air, and it's all done wirelessly. To the left of that red box you'll see the guide scope, and then the main camera, which I image with for narrowband stuff, is down at the bottom of the filter wheel. That's that big red thing hanging off the end. For some of the pictures that I showed in this review, I actually attached the camera to the telescope directly, replacing that red camera at the bottom, or I'm piggybacking the camera on top of this telescope and controlling it via Wi-Fi right on top of the camera, right on top of the telescope, and using the ASI Air and the guide scope to basically guide, and that gives me very, very sharp stars. And that also allows me to dither, which is really a big deal, especially if you're going to really push some deep and faint objects. Now, if you're wondering how long it took me to figure all this stuff out and putting this together, it took me about 1.5 years to actually build this rig right here. I'm using this new, it's called a tripod leveling head, which is not a ball head, but it's very short, and I'll post a link to it in the video down below. I really like it because it keeps the camera closer to the telescope, so that I don't have to use as heavy a counterweight. And the mount that I'm using here, this is an Ioptron 45 Pro. The 45 means it has a 45-pound capacity. There you can see me kind of demonstrating that ball head. It's not a fully flexible ball head like a regular one you'd see on a tripod. It's only got like 30 degrees of tilt, but that gives me plenty of flexibility for, you know, composing images however I want. In conclusion, okay, if you have any one of these generation of camera, if you want to do astrophotography, if you have either of these two, I would definitely say that it is worth it to upgrade to the Em1 Mk3. I am going to. I'm definitely sold. I must say that the starry sky autofocus is really a very helpful feature. It really sped up the setup process of getting ready to go. It was actually pretty incredible. There were times when I was able to come out here to the observatory and in 10 minutes I could be set up. 10 minutes, okay? I've never been able to do it that fast before. And if you're shooting remotely or you have to go to a dark sky location in order to get better astrophotos because you live in the city, like most people do, that's a big deal. So yeah, that starry sky autofocus is such a wonderful luxury. It's very accurate and it just works. And I can go out there and every once in a while stop the routine that it's in, hit the AEL button and have it check focus again. And I know that I can, with very great confidence, that I'm getting nice, sharp images. You know, it's kind of a load of stress off my back, so to speak. Because with these other two cameras, you know, I'm always wondering to myself, oh man, is the focus dead on? Is the focus dead on? You know, it's something I don't have to really stress about it anymore. And then, of course, there's the thermal aspects of this newer camera, which are a big superior edge in my opinion. You know, and if you're using Olympus lenses, which, you know, a lot of Olympus lenses are great lenses. They're very sharp. This is the 25mm f1.2, which I'll be reviewing soon. But being able to use a starry sky autofocus with them is great. Now, if you don't have that luxury, I know this guy right here, for example, is obviously not an Olympus lens, but I use it quite a bit, and I do hook this guy up here with a T-ring adapter. This is a T42 adapter, and then I have screwed into it a 42 to 48mm thread, which allows me to go onto my focal reducer. So, with the correct amount of bath poses. And when I hook this guy up to this telescope, and I'm using this guide camera, and this right here is a focuser, which allows me to focus the scope remotely. The LCD screen here is much, much better than the older one was. Well, actually, it is the same LCD screen. What I should say is that the image that it gives me, okay, is a lot better, okay? I cannot, with this older Em1 Mark 1, because of it's not being insensitive, see very well the stars, okay? And a lot of that has to do with the micro lensing. That's why they kind of look a little blurry. Whereas this guy right here, the stars get a lot smaller when you get close to perfect focus. And so even, you know, if manually focusing, I feel like I'm much more confident with this guy taking the picture hooked up to my telescope. And also, like, there's also just the ease with which composing this camera. I immediately noticed the first time I had this thing out, like I was photographing the North American Nebula, and I was able to see dark dust lanes in the actual viewfinder of the camera while I was composing my image for the North American Nebula. I've never been able to see that before with this guy. Okay, even one of the 385 dedicated astrophotography camera that we have here, I can't quite see dark dust lanes. But you know, overall, you know, I'm sold. I hope you are too. You know, if you're into astrophotography, I'm not like some Olympus fanboy or anything like that. You know, there are times when I have critical things to say, and this camera, you know, I wish it did have a nicer sensor. I wish it did have a newer EVF. All three of these cameras have the same electronic viewfinder. That's what EVF stands for. And that was actually the one reason that I didn't upgrade this guy to this guy here, the Mark II, for a very long time, was because it had the same EVF as the original Mark I. And that was the only thing about this camera that I was dissatisfied with when it comes to daytime photography. But now that I am doing astrophotography a lot more, it's a little bit less of a need, and I now need the video features for my day job, and also the much more sensitive sensors of the newer cameras for the astrophotography that I like to do. So, hope you enjoyed this review. Please like and subscribe. I hope you like the pictures too. I think they're certainly much better than I've ever been able to capture before.